In this video, we're going to learn how to master the tones and the volumes and learn the different pieces of language so that you can be more productive and successful out in the field. Now, we're using the new extinguisher. It's the 2.0, we'll call it. There's been some refinements made to get a little bit better tones, a little bit better volumes, and so that you can be more efficient and more realistic when you're out there trying to communicate with whitetail. So let's just start out with the basics on how to get the different tones. And that's really an extremely important part of deer calling when it comes to communicating at a very high level. You want to sound exactly like those deer. And there's actually been studies on this call. This call actually recreates more matching tones of deer's voice and volume of all deer calls that are out on the market combined. So that's one thing you got going for you. You got a great tool here to use. So how do we put air through a deer call? It takes very little air to get that reed to start to vibrate. So what we want to do is we want to learn how to control that airflow as the number one and the first element of learning how to communicate at a high level. What do I mean by that? Okay. The best way that I found to control your air is to actually just put air through like the bottom part of the call. And so I'm not blowing through the entire circle. I'm actually closing down with my upper lip on the top part of the call, and then the bottom part of the call is resting on my lower lip. So now I can constrict that down and I can get a more efficient flow of air. Instead of blowing with my cheeks, I'm breathing into it. And let me give you an example of how that works. Let's start out with just a basic doe sound here. I'll put that call, my upper lip is coming down at least halfway, resting on my lower lip, and I'm just breathing into the call. That's a consistent flow of air. Now, if I want to change that airflow with pressure and volume, well, let's step back a little bit. You notice my cheeks weren't puffing out. I was just breathing into that call. So the air is coming from the diaphragm through the throat and breathing into the call so I can control that air. Not with my mouth, but with my breathing, okay? So now let's do it again, and we're gonna show air pressure, what it does to the tone. Once again, it's a doe type sound. Now you're hearing a different tone. And that's just because I'm increasing that air pressure, okay? And it's a controlled release of air. So I'm ratcheting up that air and you heard a and really what that is, that's not as much tone as it is volume, okay? That's your volume. Now, how do you increase and how do you lower your volume? Let's do that. Same thing. Just barely putting air through that to get that reed to start to vibrate. All that is air pressure flow. Now watch what happens when I start to open up the chamber and you'll hear the volume increase even more. Okay, so combining your air pressures, learning how to get that airflow, and learning how to open and close that call is really what it takes to get your volume control. And practice that with everything. Practice it with the fawn. The fawn is the lightest and least amount of air that you want to put through that call as you possibly can. Because when I was studying the deer and their deer language, like real time, right next to me, what I realized was that fawn, volume of the fawn, that little bleat was so light. It really kind of struck me because that fawn would be right there, 5 yards away, and you could barely hear that fawn. But you know what happened? The mom heard it and she came out of the timber. So once again, low volume. Let's do the fawn here. That's just starting the volume, and now let's put a little bit of inflection in there and control it, open it. Okay? Now, I just want to let you know that right now we're not actually getting into language. We're just working on our volumes and we're just touching on the tone. And the tone's going to come next. So we're going to do volumes for the fawn, we're going to do volumes for the doe, and then we're going to do volumes for the buck. That was your fawn, here's your doe. If you want a younger sounding doe, you just slide the slide up slightly. Okay, we're just slowly increasing that volume. We're practicing. We're getting sounds. We're just getting the feel like you're playing a musical instrument. Now let's go down to the buck. A buck takes just a light wisp of air to get that reed to flutter and get that kind of coarse sound. Okay, it's just a light sound. And it takes less air pressure to pick the volume up on the buck too. The buck will volume up quicker. Not putting near as much air into it as I do when I do some of my other calls with the doe. So there's your volume and there's how to control your volume. That's extremely important. You have to master that first so that you can master how to talk to the deer and get the different inflections and do the different communication. And think of it like this. I'm crossing the street, and I've used this scenario before. I'm crossing the street and I make eye contact with somebody and I say, hey, how you doing? You know, that's a normal reaction. They say, oh, pretty good, you know. Or I could say, hey, how do I get down the street over here, you know, to this place? And you get a normal conversation. That's what we're looking for here. But now if you come over and you cross the street and you're staring at that person and you go, hey, what are they gonna do? They're gonna freak. And that happens definitely the majority of the time when you're out calling deer in the timber. The majority of the time, people are over calling with volume, and it is so extremely important. And part of the problem is most of the calls out there don't allow you to control that volume. So you may be thinking you're saying the right thing and you're calling at a deer and that deer looks and you're like, oh, I got his attention. And then they fade off because they're freaked out. So that's why I want the volume first, because volume is extremely important when it comes to communicating with deer in their natural environment with their natural volume. Okay? Now, step 2. Let's get into tone. And tone variation can be done a variety of different ways. And there's a reason you change that tone and that volume. And it basically boils down to the communication piece like I just talked about. Do I talk kindly and softly to somebody normally? Or do I yell at them? And it's the same kind of concept. What you're doing is you're creating emotion, okay? You're creating emotion. So like, I could be talking to you like this, and this is the deer call that we're going to do, and then we're going to put that in. There's no emotion in that. But if I'm talking to you like this, hey, and I'm using I'm communicating with you and trying to, let you know what I mean and why I'm talking that way has a big impact. The way I express it to you has a massive impact on how you're going to receive what I'm saying to you. And you have to think that way when it comes to deer calling, okay? So the volume, extremely important, practice it. And now the tone, let's get into the tones. I love playing around with buck tones. That's my favorite thing to do on a call. So just because it excites me and I see a buck out there and I think about what they do and I think about what I want to say to them and I watch their reaction. And if you can get confident in that with your volumes and your tones, it's going to completely change the way you hunt, and it's completely change the way the deer react to you. It's extremely important, okay? So, tone variations. I'm going to write it down because people like to put the old buck out there. That kind of seems to be what we gravitate toward. You think, hey, if I sound like a big old buck, I'm going to shoot a big old buck. That's not necessarily true, but we'll get into that later. But I'm going to go down to the lowest setting on the buck, and I'm going to start out with tone variation. With no cupping and no baffle hands, no chambering, no nothing, a buck will sound, the call will sound like this, and the buck position. Not bad, but that's not what they sound like out in the timber, okay? Let's close that hand over. What I like to do is I put it between my thumb and my forefinger, and then I got 3 fingers that I can wrap around and close down the call with. That's how I'm controlling the tone. Now, the other thing is to create a deep chamber with the other hand, okay? I'm making a cupping feel here. And I got a cup like I want to hold water. I want to keep it tight. I don't want air and sound coming out of that. Only where I want to release it, which in this case is through the circle of the thumb and the index finger. Everything else is sealed off. So watch what happens now. Now we're going to close down the call. We call it choking. Without choke. And I just made a slight finger adjustment there and had 2 different tones. Now we're controlling our tones. And this is, you've got to practice this. And I love to practice it, but you do have to practice this. Let's add a chambering to that. You hear that tone change? Now we're getting a guttural, more of a guttural sound. Now I'm going to change my choking, my chambering, my release, and my air pressures. All those things combined, practice and learn different tones. Because all bucks sound different. I sound different than, well, everybody has a unique voice, and bucks have a unique voice too. A lot of times we think we hear, oh, that's a deep guttural, that's got to be a giant. And then a little forky comes up. You know, they just have different voices. So anyway, let's go there. We're going to go for tone variations, choke, chamber, and air pressure. I just did some pretty cool stuff there. You know what I mean? Not getting into language, not getting into communication yet. Play around and see what different kinds of sounds you can get. I'm going to try and throw a few of them out here. Let's do some clicking maybe, and it's just some different tones. So. All I'm doing when I'm doing my clicking is going. That's it. I'm making a T sound. And I'm popping a little air on that thing. And it may not sound right at first, but you'll figure it out. And that's where the practice comes in. So there's your clicking sounds. There's your grunting sounds. And let's try and really just like blow out the call. Almost like you're screaming into a microphone. It just gets all distorted. We can do that with the call too. Okay? Play around with that. You might have to close down your lips to just a little bit of air going in there at a very high pressure to get that distortion sound, and how you're choking that call off is going to make a difference on whether the sound gets through the reed or the reed locks up, because you can lock the reeds up too with too much pressure, like this. I'm choking it down too far and I'm putting too much pressure in and the reed locks up. So I have to learn how to control that pressure. I have to learn how to control that choking. And then I have to learn how to release that to get the sounds I'm looking for. Well, that's where the practice comes in. Let's do that again. You hear how that got a little deeper? I actually increased the volume in my cheeks as I let that pressure out, and it actually changed the tone as well. So these are a lot of things for you to work on, and I'm going through them pretty quick here, but feel free to pause the video, work on a few things, and then move on to the next thing that we're talking about. All right, so now let's go up to the do. Okay, the do volumes and inflections. Okay, inflections are important with a do because her emotions, it's more of a flat sound, but but the way you inflect that means different things when it comes to vocabulary. Once more, tone inflection with a doe. Imagine a doe going, rah. She's opening her mouth. So that's what we're gonna try and mimic here. That's pretty high volume. A lot of times I won't go quite that, mostly I won't go quite that high. And you can go the other way. You can go ow, or you can go ooh, and they mean different things or different types of emotion. Same thing with the fawn. That's so natural. That sounds so much like a fawn. It's crazy, but, and then you can go the other way with it. And they mean two different things, okay? So if they're saying something to their mom, it's more communication with the doe. So those are the core and the basics of how to control your call to get good volume and to get good tone. And in these next steps, we're going to talk about the different pieces of language, what they mean, and if you can get those down perfectly and get those volumes that are genuine to what the deer are doing, you're going to have a completely different interaction with deer when it comes to your hunting.